In the archives of the National Weather Service, hidden amongst the digital records of modern supercells and the radar loops of the 21st century, there lies a statistical impossibility. It is a single entry, a record from 1917. To the casual observer, it looks like a clerical error, a typo, because the data suggests that a single tornado, one continuous, grinding, rotating column of air, touched down in Missouri and didn't lift back up for 7 hours and 20 minutes. 7 hours. Think about that. Most tornadoes are violent but brief tantrums. They touch down, they destroy a few blocks, and they dissipate. The average lifespan of a tornado is less than 10 minutes. But this thing punched a clock. It started a shift. The record states it carved a scar across the earth that measured 293 miles long. That is the distance from New York City to Washington, D.C. Imagine a blender, 2.5 blocks wide, set to the highest setting, grinding its way from the Empire State Building to the steps of the Capitol, without stopping once. Physics says this shouldn't be possible. Meteorology says energy cannot sustain that kind of friction, that kind of violence, for that long, without breaking. The storm has to breathe. The storm has to die. But on May 26th, 1917, the people of Illinois didn't care about physics. They didn't care about meteorological theory, because they were too busy dying. This is the story of the Mattoon-Charleston outbreak, the day the sky over the Midwest turned into a weapon. And the day we learned that sometimes, the monsters in the dark don't just visit, they travel, and they take everything with them. To understand the horror of what happened that Saturday, you have to understand the silence. Today, we live in a world of constant noise. If a storm forms in Oklahoma, your phone buzzes in your pocket in Chicago. You have Doppler radar apps. You have sirens. You have a meteorologist on Twitter drawing a red polygon over your house 20 minutes before the first raindrop falls. You have time. But in 1917, you had nothing. You had your eyes. You had your ears. And if it was nighttime, or if the rain was too heavy to see through, you had nothing but a prayer. The United States in 1917 was a nation holding its breath, but not because of the weather. The world was burning. The Great War. World War I was raging in the trenches of Europe. America had just entered the fight a month prior. The newspapers were not filled with weather maps. They were filled with casualty lists, names of boys from Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri, who were shipping off to France to fight in the mud. Nobody was looking west, and even if they were, the government didn't want them to worry. This is a fact that sounds insane to us today. But in 1917, the United States Signal Corps, which managed the Weather Bureau, had a strict policy regarding severe weather. They were forbidden, literally forbidden, from using the word tornado in a forecast. The logic was cold and bureaucratic. They believed that the panic caused by the prediction of a tornado would kill more people than the tornado itself. They believed you. The public couldn't handle the truth, so they sanitized it. They called them severe local storms. They called them wind shifts. They saw a loaded gun pointed at the heart of the country, and they described it as a breezy afternoon. So, on the morning of May 26th, when the sun rose over the Mississippi River, the millions of people living in the path of this monster woke up to a forecast that promised unsettled weather. Unsettled. That was the only warning they got. Let's go back to that morning, May 26th, 1917. The atmosphere over the central United States is wrong. If you were a farmer standing on your porch in central Illinois that morning, you would have felt it on your skin. The air wasn't just warm, it was heavy, sticky. It felt like a wet wool blanket draped over your shoulders. This is what meteorologists call the cap. Imagine a lid on a boiling pot. The heat is rising from the Gulf of Mexico, pumping warm, moist energy into the Midwest. But above it, around 10,000 feet up, there is a layer of cold, dry air trapping it all down. Pressure. Ideally, the steam escapes a little at a time. You get a shower, you get a rumble of thunder. The pressure releases. But on this day, the lid is sealed tight. The sun is baking the ground. heating that air near the surface, making it want to rise, making it want to explode upwards. But the cap is holding it down, suppressing it, building it. For hours. The energy accumulates. It is a bomb, waiting for a detonator. That detonator arrives at noon. A cold front, a sharp, aggressive wedge of chilled air drives in from the Rockies. It hits that boiling pot of humid air over Missouri, and the lid blows. The first reports come from Kansas the day before. On May 25th, a tornado strikes the town of Andale. 20 people are killed. It's a warning shot, a signal that the atmosphere has turned volatile, but the system shifts. It moves east. It crosses the border into Missouri. At 12:00 p.m. on May 26th, the sky over Louisiana, Missouri, begins to darken. But not like a normal storm. Normal storms are gray. They are blue. Survivors from 1917 describe this sky as bruised, a sickly combination of purple, yellow, and a deep, nauseating green. Green clouds are a sign of hail. Massive amounts of ice suspended in the updraft, refracting the sunlight. If you see green, it means the storm is incredibly tall and incredibly strong. A supercell has formed. It isn't a tornado yet. It is apparent. A rotating cathedral of cloud that is spinning like a top. It drifts toward the Mississippi River, the natural border between Missouri and Illinois, and as it crosses the water, it drops its payload. Imagine you are standing on the Illinois bank of the river. It is early afternoon. The birds have stopped singing. That is always the first sign. The ambient noise of nature, the crickets, the cicadas, the birds, they all go silent. They can sense the pressure drop. Their biology tells them to hide. The wind dies down. The leaves on the trees stop rustling. It becomes dead, calm. And then you hear it. At first, it sounds like a train. That's the cliché, right? It sounded like a freight train. But in 1917, trains were everywhere. The sound of a distant locomotive was the soundtrack of American life. So, many people ignore it. They think it's the 2:15 express to St. Louis, but the sound doesn't fade. It doesn't pass. It gets louder. A low frequency, thrumming, vibration. You can feel it in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The supercell crosses into Illinois, and the bottom of the cloud begins to lower. It doesn't look like a funnel yet. It looks like the whole sky is descending. A wall cloud, a pedestal, and then a finger. A jagged, dark extension reaches down and scratches the earth. It touches. The dust kicks up. Mud, water, and debris begin to circulate. The timer starts. It is now on the ground. The beast has been born, and it is hungry. It moves east-northeast. This is the classic kill path for Midwest tornadoes. They ride the jet stream. And this one is moving fast. Most tornadoes walk. They travel at 30, maybe 40 miles per hour. You can drive away from them. This one is sprinting. Meteorologists estimate the forward speed of the storm was over 60 miles per hour. Think about that speed. If you were in a car in 1917, a Model T Ford, you top out at 40 miles per hour on a flat, paved road. And the roads in Illinois were not paved. They were dirt. They were mud. You cannot outrun this. If you see it, it is already too late. The tornado tears through the rural farmland near the river. Barns explode, not collapse. Explode. The pressure difference is so extreme that the air inside the structures expands instantly, blowing the walls outward. Livestock are lifted into the air and thrown half a mile. Massive oak trees, 100-year-old sentinels, are snapped at the base like dry twigs. But this is just the warm-up. This is just the storm clearing its throat. It is heading for civilization. It is heading for the grid. If you look at a map of Illinois, you see a grid. It's a checkerboard of farmland, dotted with small towns. Nebo, Pearl, Whitehall, Modesto. The storm visits them all. In Nebo, the darkness descends at 12:15 p.m. Roofs are peeled back like the lids of sardine cans. In Whitehall, The local residents are eating lunch. They hear the roar. They run to their root cellars. The lucky ones make it. The unlucky ones are found in the fields, hundreds of yards away. But the storm is doing something strange. Usually, a tornado creates a path that looks like a snake. It winds, it wobbles, it lifts up, skips a mile, and touches down again. This storm is drawing a straight line, a ruler straight line. It is mechanically precise. It is locking onto a specific latitude and refusing to deviate. And directly in the center of that line, sitting squarely in the crosshairs, are two cities, the twin cities of Coles County, Mattoon and Charleston. They are 11 miles apart. They are industrious. They are booming. Mattoon is a railroad hub, a town built on the intersection of the Illinois Central and the Big Four railroads. It is a town of iron and steam. Charleston is a university town, a town of books and baseball. Between them, they hold nearly 20,000 people. And neither of them knows what is coming. Let's zoom in on Mattoon. It is 3:00 p.m. The heat is oppressive. On Broadway Avenue, the main commercial strip, the shops are open. It's Saturday. Families are out. Men are in the barber shops, talking about the war, talking about the price of corn. Women are in the general stores, buying flour, buying fabric. Children are playing in the streets. There is a sense of normalcy that is heartbreaking to look back on. We know, looking at the history books, that they have less than 45 minutes left. The telegraph lines to the west have gone dead. That should have been the warning. When the lines go dead, it means the poles are down. It means something severed the connection. But in 1917, lines went down all the time. A fallen branch. A bad connection. Nobody panicked. The station master at the Mattoon Railroad Depot is likely trying to tap out a message to the next station down the line, getting nothing but static. Static. That's the sound of the storm approaching. The electromagnetic interference from the massive lightning output of the Supercell is scrambling the signals. The storm is jamming the radar, before radar was even invented. 3:30 p.m. The sky over Mattoon begins to change. It's not just dark anymore, it is black, ink black. The wind begins to pick up, but it's hot wind. It feels like the breath of an oven. People on the street stop what they are doing. They look up, and they see it. To the southwest, on the horizon. The clouds are boiling. They aren't moving west to east. They are rotating. The entire western horizon seems to be churning, mixing, folding in on itself. And then, the siren of the 20th century makes its debut. Not an electric siren, but the factory whistles, the railroad shops, the power plant, the factories on the edge of town. The men in the boiler rooms see the funnel. They grab the pull cords on the steam whistles and they yank them down hard. A long, mournful scream echoes across the city. It's the only warning system they have. Fire, some people think. Train accident, others think. But then, the sound changes. The whistles are drowned out. The low-frequency rumble that started in Missouri has evolved. It is now a deafening, grinding roar. It sounds like a million stones being crushed together in a giant tumbler. The people of Mattoon look west, and they see the monster. It isn't a thin rope anymore. It isn't a graceful funnel. It is a wedge, a massive, wide wall of debris. It is so wide, nearly half a mile at the base, that it doesn't even look like a tornado. It looks like the horizon has decided to stand up and walk. And it is pitch black, illuminated only by the constant, strobe light flashing of power lines snapping and transformers exploding inside the vortex. Pop, flash, crack, flash, blue and orange sparks dancing in the dark. It is moving parallel to the railroad tracks. It is following the iron road straight into the heart of the city. It crosses the city limits. The first houses in the residential district are not just damaged. They are erased. The wood splinters instantly. The bricks are pulverized into dust. The roar becomes so loud that you cannot hear your own scream. The time for running is over. The time for hiding is over. the shadow falls over the first block. The 293-mile nightmare has arrived in Mattoon. We have talked about Mattoon. We have talked about Charleston. The cities get the headlines. But the storm didn't stop at the city limits. When the tornado pulverized the baseball diamond in Charleston, it didn't dissolve. It didn't go back into the clouds. It kept eating. It moved east towards the embarrassed river bottoms. This is a part of the story that rarely gets told because there were no reporters there. There were no telegraph operators. There were just isolated farmhouses, sitting in the dark, waiting for the end of the world. To understand the fear of a farmer in 1917, you have to understand the isolation. If you are in the city, you can scream and a neighbor might hear you. If you are on a farm in the embarrassed bottoms, nobody can hear you. The storm crossed the river with such violence that it reportedly sucked the water out of the channel. It turned the riverbed into a muddy trench for a few seconds before the water rushed back in. And then, it hit the farm of the Sweeney family. We have records that describe the eccentricity of the wind here. A tornado is not a solid wall. It is a collection of mini vortices, subvortices. Little tornadoes spinning inside the big tornado. These subvortices act like scalp-ups. On the Sweeney farm, the house was leveled, the barn was leveled. But the family chicken coop, a flimsy structure made of chicken wire and thin wood, was left standing. The chickens inside were untouched, yet 50 feet away, a heavy iron plow was twisted into a knot. This psychological torture, the randomness of who lives and who dies, broke people. We have accounts of farmers walking out of their basements, seeing their entire livelihood destroyed, seeing their neighbors dead, but finding a single, fragile porcelain teacup sitting upright on a fence post. It felt like a mockery. The storm continued east, grinding through the towns of Embarrass and Ashmore. At Ashmore, the track width widened again. The cyclic nature of the storm was in full effect. The Charleston tornado was dying out, and a third tornado was likely forming to take its place. This third monster was the one that would aim for the state line. I want to pause the map for a second to talk about one specific detail found in the debris east of Charleston: the straw. It is the most famous cliché in tornado lore. A piece of straw driven into a telephone pole. Mythbusters tried to replicate this. Physics teachers calculate the velocity needed. It seems impossible. Straw is weak, wood is hard, but in 1917, they didn't need Mythbusters. They had the evidence. Searchers found pieces of dry wheat straw driven 2 inches deep into solid oak trees. How? The answer lies in the acceleration. Inside the vortex, debris isn't just spinning, it is vibrating. The wind speeds fluctuate so wildly, from 0 to 200 miles per hour in a fraction of a second, that the debris acts like a bullet. For a microsecond, that piece of straw has the kinetic energy of a rifle round. It doesn't push the wood aside, it liquefies the wood fibers upon impact, enters the liquid wood, and then the wood instantly solidifies around it. It is a fusion of biology and botany that only happens at EF4 speeds. And it wasn't just straw. In one field, they found a Model T Ford, or what used to be a Model T. The engine block, a solid piece of cast iron weighing hundreds of pounds, was found a quarter-mile away from the chassis. To separate an engine from a car frame requires tools. It requires bolts to be unscrewed. It requires a hoist. The wind did it in 1 second. It simply shook the car so hard and twisted the frame so violently that the iron bolts sheared off and the engine was flung like a stone. This is the power that was now heading for Indiana. 5:04 p.m. The storm crosses the border. Usually, weather systems weaken when they cross terrain features or lose the heat of the day. But this system was feeding on a low-level jet. A tube of high-speed wind around 5,000 feet up was pumping energy directly into the storm's heart. It was like hooking a fuel line into a running engine. So, instead of dying, the storm regenerated. It entered Indiana. It hit the town of Oaktown. It hit the town of Brevort. But here, the story changes. In Illinois, it was a tragedy of the afternoon. People were awake. They saw it coming. In Indiana, night was falling. The sun sets around 7 p.m. in late May. But under the storm clouds, it was dark by 5:30. The people of Indiana didn't see a black wall. They saw flashes, lightning. Imagine looking out your window into the pitch-black night. You hear a roar, but you can't see anything. Then, a lightning bolt flashes, and for 1/10 of a second, illuminated by the blue-white light, you see a monster in your backyard. Then, darkness again. That strobe light horror is what the families in Indiana endured. They had to time their run to the cellar based on the lightning flashes. Flash, it's a mile away. Flash, it's half a mile away. Flash, it's here. The storm carved a path through the southern counties of Indiana that lasted for hours. It didn't lift until it reached the far side of the state. When the meteorologists finally tallied the time, they looked at the start time in Missouri, 12 past p.m., and the end time in Indiana, 7:20 p.m. 7 hours, 20 minutes. Whether it was one tornado or a family of 4 or 8, the result was the same. A continuous scar. We rely so much on visuals and documentaries. We show you pictures of wrecked houses. We play sounds of wind. But survivors always talk about the smell. If you speak to anyone who survived the 1917 outbreak, or their descendants, they will tell you that the air didn't smell like rain. It smelled like a forest fire. When a tornado shreds a house, it pulverizes the wood. It releases the sap, the resin, the ancient chemicals inside the timber. It shreds the leaves of trees, releasing chlorophyll. It breaks natural gas lines, releasing sulfur. And the lightning, the millions of volts of electricity arcing around the funnel, creates ozone. So the smell of the Mattoon-Charleston tornado was a toxic perfume of pine sap, cut grass, rotten eggs, and burning wire. Survivors said that smell lingered for weeks. Every time they smelled cut lumber for the rest of their lives, they flinched. Every time they smelled ozone before a thunderstorm, they panicked. It was a sensory trigger that never went away. As the sun finally set on that Saturday, the full weight of the long night began to settle in. We have to talk about the children. In 1917, families were large. It was common to have 5, 6, 7 kids. When the houses collapsed, the children were often the most vulnerable. They were small. They were easily buried. In the confusion of the aftermath, a terrible phenomenon occurred. The lost child listings. The Sunday newspapers, printed on emergency presses the next morning, didn't just list the dead. They listed descriptions of living toddlers found wandering in the rubble. Found, boy, approx, 3 years old, blonde hair, wearing a blue shirt, found near 14th Street, doesn't know his name. Found, girl, infant, unharmed, found in a ditch near the railroad tracks. Parents were dead, or parents were in a hospital in another town, unconscious. These children were the storm orphans. Some were reunited days later. Some were taken in by neighbors and raised as their own. But there are stories, dark rumors from the time, of children who were never identified. They were simply swallowed by the chaos of the wartime bureaucracy. This is the true horror of the disaster. Not just the loss of life, but the loss of lineage, the loss of history. Entire family trees were pruned in a single afternoon. By Sunday morning, May 27th, the storm system had moved south. It was terrorizing Tennessee and Alabama now. But in Illinois, the sun came out. It was a brilliant, clear, spring day. The contrast was sickening. The birds started singing again. The sun warmed the mud. But the landscape looked like the moon. The Illinois National Guard arrived. They didn't come with Doppler radar. They came with rifles. Martial law was declared. They set up a perimeter around Mattoon and Charleston. They had orders to shoot looters on sight. Because, yes, even in the midst of the apocalypse, human nature is a mixed bag. While heroes were digging through the rubble with their bare hands, thieves were crawling through the broken store windows, stealing jewelry from the bodies of the dead. The Guard put a stop to it. They set up tent cities. Massive canvas tents, surplus from the War Department, were erected in the parks. The Twin Cities became refugee camps, and as the shock wore off, the questions began. Why didn't we know? Why didn't the whistle blow sooner? Why is the government banning the word tornado? The grief was turning into anger. and that anger would eventually change the science of meteorology forever. But first, they had to bury the dead. 101 people were gone, and the investigation was just beginning. May 27th, 1917, Sunday. In the Bible, Sunday is a day of rest, a day of worship. But in Mattoon and Charleston, there were no churches left standing to worship in. The sun rose at 5:32 a.m. It revealed a sky that was painfully, insultingly blue. The humidity had broken. The birds were singing. The air was crisp. But on the ground, the light of the sun revealed the true scale of the atrocity. In the darkness of Saturday night, the survivors had only seen pieces of the puzzle, a wall down here, a roof missing there. They were trapped in their own little bubbles of trauma, but the daylight connected the dots. If you stood on the roof of the surviving bank building in Mattoon and looked north, you didn't see a city. You saw a landfill. For 40 blocks, the landscape was leveled. It wasn't just that the houses were gone. It was that the colors were wrong. A city is usually a mix of colors. Red bricks, white siding, green trees, black asphalt. But the tornado had homogenized everything into a single, monochromatic shade of gray. The lumber was coated in mud. The trees were stripped of bark. The streets were covered in pulverized mortar. It looked like the surface of the moon. And then the sound began. Not the wind, not the screams, the hammers. It is a uniquely American sound, the sound of reconstruction starting before the bodies are even cold. Men were already out. They didn't have heavy machinery. They didn't have bulldozers. They had hands. They had shovels. They had saws. They started digging. But they weren't just digging for possessions. They were digging for the missing. The newspaper headlines that morning were chaotic. The Mattoon Journal-Gazette, which miraculously managed to print a single-sheet emergency edition, ran the headline, "Mattoon devastated, 50 dead, hundreds injured." But the numbers were wrong. They were guessing. Nobody knew who was dead and who was just gone. In 1917, there was no centralized database, no social media check-in. If your aunt lived on 14th Street and you couldn't find her, and her house was a pile of splinters, you didn't know if she was in a hospital in Peoria or if she was under the wood. So you dug, you moved board, by board, and sometimes you found things you wish you hadn't. One survivor reported finding a family photo album sitting perfectly on top of a pile of rubble. He opened it. It was dry. Beneath the pile was the family. But as the morning wore on, a new horror arrived. It didn't come from the sky. It came from the rails. The disaster tourist. This is a dark chapter in the human psychology. When a tragedy happens, people want to see it. By noon on Sunday, the trains arriving in Mattoon and Charleston were packed, not with doctors, not with nurses, with spectators. People came from Chicago, from St. Louis, from Indianapolis. They bought tickets specifically to come and gawk at the ruins. They walked through the streets dressed in their Sunday best, men in suits, women in hats. They stepped over the debris of people's lives. They took photos. Some of them even picked up souvenirs. A broken clock, a child's doll, a piece of the smashed grandstand. Imagine you are a father digging through the wreckage of your home, trying to find your wedding ring, trying to process the fact that your life is over, and you look up and see a stranger from Chicago pointing a camera at you. The tension was explosive. Fistfights broke out in the streets. Grief was turning into rage. The mayor of Mattoon saw this happening. He realized the city was about to lose control. So, he called the governor. Send the troops. By Sunday evening, the Illinois National Guard arrived, Company M, the 4th Illinois Infantry. They marched into the city with fixed bayonets. They didn't come to help dig. They came to establish order. They set up a perimeter. They declared martial law. The order was given, looters will be shot, and they meant it. The city was cordoned off. You needed a pass to enter. You needed a pass to leave. The Twin Cities ceased to be a democracy. They became a military zone. The sightseers were forced back onto the trains. The cameras were put away. And finally, under the watch of armed guards, the families could grieve in peace. while the soldiers walked the streets, the real war was happening in the hospitals. We have to contextualize the medicine of 1917. We are so used to modern trauma care. If you get hurt today, you get a CT scan, you get antibiotics, you get sterile surgery. In 1917, penicillin was still 11 years away from being discovered. Think about that. Alexander Fleming wouldn't find the mold until 1928. So, for the 400 people injured in this storm, the biggest threat wasn't the broken bone. It was the dirt. Tornado wounds are dirty. The wind drives soil, manure, and rust deep into the muscle tissue. This is the perfect breeding ground for two killers, gangrene and tetanus. Lockjaw. In the days following the storm, the death toll didn't stop. It crept up. A man who survived the collapse of his house with just a cut on his leg would develop a fever 3 days later. His leg would turn black, the infection would hit his blood, and he would die. The doctors knew this. They were terrified of it. So their treatments were medieval. They used iodine, carbolic acid, and amputation. If a limb looked bad, they didn't wait. They took it. There were so many amputations performed in the Mattoon hospital that Sunday that the nurses ran out of disposal bins. It was a butcher shop. And remember, the Spanish flu was just around the corner. The medical system was already strained. This disaster pushed it to the breaking point. The sheer volume of head trauma was also unprecedented. Flying bricks do terrible things to the human skull. Many survivors who recovered were never the same. They suffered from what we would now call traumatic brain injury, TBI, or severe PTSD. But in 1917, there was no word for PTSD. They called it shell shock, and they usually reserved that term for soldiers in France. But the people of Mattoon had the same 1,000-yard stare as the boys in the trenches. They jumped at loud noises. They shook when the wind blew. They were veterans of a war that lasted only 7 minutes. Before we analyze the science, we have to correct a historical oversight. Most history books stop at the Indiana border. They tell you about Mattoon and Charleston, and then they fade to black. But the atmosphere doesn't care about state lines. The storm system that destroyed the Twin Cities didn't just vanish. It evolved. It was part of a massive synoptic scale outbreak. This means the entire weather pattern over the central United States was hostile. As the sun set on Illinois and the rescue crews lit their lanterns, the energy shifted south, overnight, and into the next day. The storms targeted the Deep South, Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky. This is the forgotten outbreak. In Dyersburg, Tennessee, another massive tornado struck. It killed people. It leveled plantations. In Alabama, the storms tore through rural communities that had even less warning than Mattoon. If you look at the total death toll for the sequence, from May 25th to June 1st, it is staggering. Nearly 400 people died across the Midwest and South. The Mattoon storm was just the headliner. It was the celebrity monster. But there was a whole cast of killers working in the shadows. This context is crucial because it changes the narrative. This wasn't a freak accident. This was a synchronized atmospheric assault. It was a week where the sky simply refused to stabilize. Now, we arrive at the central mystery, the hook of our story, the longest tornado. Open any record book published before 1990, and it will tell you that the Mattoon tornado holds the record for the longest continuous path in Illinois history. 293 miles, 7 hours, and 20 minutes. It is a number that commands respect. It puts the storm in the same league as the infamous tri-state tornado of 1925, which traveled 219 miles. But there is a problem: physics. As meteorology advanced in the 1960s and 70s, largely thanks to the legendary Dr. Ted Fujita, the man who created the F-scale, scientists began to look back at these old records with skepticism. They realized that a single tornado maintaining a violent circulation for 7 hours is thermodynamically nearly impossible. A tornado is a delicate balance. It needs warm air flowing in and cold air flowing out. Eventually, the rear flank downdraft, the cold rain-wrapped air, wraps all the way around the funnel. It cuts off the warm inflow. The tornado chokes, it dies. So, how do you explain a 293-mile path? The answer lies in the family. The modern theory, supported by reanalyzing the damage tracks, is that the Mattoon storm was a cyclic supercell. Here is how it works. And it is terrifyingly efficient. Imagine the supercell as a factory. Its job is to produce tornadoes. It spins up Tornado A, the Mattoon storm. Tornado A runs for 60 miles. It destroys the city. It eats. But then, the cold air wraps around it. It starts to die. Does the storm stop? No. The factory floor just shifts. The updraft, the mesocyclone, reorganizes itself. It moves a few miles to the southeast. It finds a pocket of fresh, warm air. And it drops Tornado B, the Charleston storm. As Tornado B touches down, Tornado A lifts up. For a few minutes, they might overlap. Then Tornado B runs for 40 miles. It gets choked off. The storm drops Tornado C. This process repeats, over and over and over. To the people on the ground in 1917, who didn't have radar, who couldn't see the cloud tops, it looked like one continuous line. If your barn was destroyed by Tornado A, and your cousin's barn in the next county was destroyed by Tornado B, and the timing matches, you assume it was the same storm. You connect the dots with a ruler, but it wasn't a line. It was a dash line. Meteorologists now believe the 293-mile path was actually a family of at least 4, possibly 8, separate tornadoes. Does this make it less impressive? No. In fact, it makes it scarier, because it means the supercell itself, the parent cloud, was a juggernaut. It had the endurance of a marathon runner. It maintained its rotation for 7 hours across 2 states, methodically dropping bomb after bomb. It was a machine. This puts the Mattoon storm in direct conversation with the tri-state tornado of 1925. The tri-state, which killed 695 people, is generally accepted as being a single tornado for most of its life. It was a freak of nature, a singular event. The Mattoon storm was the classic outbreak. It is the textbook example of how the atmosphere recycles energy. And here is the twist. Because of the lack of technology in 1917, we will never know for sure. We can't go back and look at the radar data. We can't check the velocity signatures. We only have the scar. The debate continues to this day. Some purists still argue for the single track. Most accept the family theory. But to the families of the one dead, the science is academic, whether it was 1 funnel or 10. The result was the empty chair at the dinner table. What did we learn? Usually, disasters bring change. The Titanic sank. We got better lifeboat regulations. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory burned. We got fire codes. Did the Mattoon tornado change weather forecasting? Yes, but slowly. The biggest failure of 1917 was the ban, the prohibition on the word tornado. After the destruction of Mattoon and Charleston, the public outrage began to simmer. Newspaper editorials asked the hard question. If the Weather Bureau knew the conditions were dangerous, why didn't they tell us? The Signal Corps defended their policy. They claimed that panic was the enemy, but the cracks in that logic were showing. Survivors argued, I would rather be panicked and in a cellar than calm and dead in my living room. It would take another huge disaster, the tri-state tornado in 1925, to finally break the system. But the Mattoon event was the first strike against the wall of silence. It started the conversation about spotter networks. After 1917, towns began to realize they couldn't rely on Washington, D.C. to save them. They had to save themselves. Local telephone operators became the de facto warning system. If a storm hit Mattoon, the operator in Mattoon, if she was still alive and her board was working, would plug in the jack for Charleston and scream, "It's coming! Ring the bells!" This telephone tree warning system was the great-grandfather of the modern tornado siren. It was born out of the failure of 1917. Every time your phone buzzes today with an emergency alert, every time you hear that siren test on the first Tuesday of the month, you are hearing the echo of Mattoon. You are hearing the lesson we learned in blood. If you go to Mattoon or Charleston today, you won't see the ruin. The houses have been rebuilt. The trees have grown back. The baseball field in Charleston is there, filled with cheering crowds on summer nights. The scar has healed. Nature is resilient. It covers its tracks with grass and asphalt. But if you know where to look, the memory is there. It's in the cemeteries, specifically the dates on the headstones. Walk through Dodge Grove Cemetery. Look for the year 1917. Look for the date May 26th. You will see them, row after row, fathers, mothers, infants. They are the silent witnesses to the day the sky turned green. And if you drive out into the country, onto the grid of farm roads between the towns, stop your car, turn off the engine, listen to the wind. It's just a breeze now, gentle, harmless. But the physics hasn't changed. The atmosphere is the same today as it was in 1917. The Gulf of Mexico is still warm. The jet stream is still fast. We have radar now. We have satellites. We have structure. But we are not immune. The monster that walked for 7 hours across Illinois is gone. But its descendants are still out there, waiting for the right combination of heat, moisture, and shear, waiting for the cap to break. The Mattoon-Charleston tornado reminds us of a humble truth. We do not conquer the weather. We only survive it. And sometimes, we don't.